Welcome. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Somos, and I'm a fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. Our speaker tonight is Professor James Russell Muirhead, Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics at Dartmouth College. Russ received his AB and PhD in government from Harvard, and another BA in PPE from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. Before Dartmouth, Russ taught at Williams College, Harvard, and the University of Texas at Austin. More than anyone else I know, Russ asks questions that are simple, foundational, and powerful in unexpected ways. In one book, he tackled the obvious. Why do we work? Do our senses of community and personal interest combine to nudge us toward a natural and rewarding job that fits who we are so well that it fulfills us as individuals and becomes a source of dignity and a dimension of justice in complex societies? And if the job that nature and nurture led us to comes into conflict with this harmony, what means and principles are both just and pragmatic in helping us and our society to adjust? How have these mediating means and principles changed over time? Is the elusive work-life balance, in fact, a cascade of contradictions in terms? Russ has a truly rare ability to rediscover and re-examine foundations. This makes him, though he'll probably disagree with me, first and foremost a philosopher who surveys and builds upon a landscape in which politics is just one feature among many. Tonight, Russ will share his insights into the nature, depth, and utility function of partisanship as a phenomenon and as a passion. What is, when it comes down to it, the desirable degree of the general public's hands-on political involvement? If they have princes, then can the people be without ambition? Can they be apolitical? Is meaningful political engagement always and inherently corrupting? And was the nomination of Barry Goldwater the start of an idealistic American death wish? Such are some of the threads with which Russ will trace the irreducibly personal and human behind what we think of as depersonalized and impersonal systems and rules. I also have to warn you, though, that Russ, at the same time, is an exquisite rhetorician. He will start with a very simple question, and you may not at first realize how serious the question is. But an incredible amount of work and passion and talent go into the way he tells an always original argument. If tonight you stop for 1 second to sit on the edge of your seat, a few minutes later you may not know what hit you. Whatever topic he deals with, the way Russ develops an argument will reawaken you to an unexhausted vitality of political thought that most of us have forgotten, and those who still remember think is no longer possible. The only problem, I think, is that he makes it seem too elegant and effortless. As some of us who tried to argue in a similar vein know, it's actually very hard to achieve Russ's knack for critical freshness. So for the rest of us, why work indeed? I'm going to end on a personal note because I think it helps to understand what is at stake tonight. 16 years ago, I had to figure out where to apply for grad school. István Hont, one of my professors at the time, advised me to apply to Harvard. And I asked him why. And those of you who knew him would imagine that he could have come up with so many different answers. Because to learn how the world works, you have to leave tiny Europe at some point, he could have said. Because despite its shortcomings, that place still works. Because too much time in the other Cambridge will certainly warp you, and so on. Instead, he exuberantly advised me to apply here because the nicest man he ever met was here. And his name was Russ Muirhead. Even though I hadn't met him at that point, it's very uncharacteristic of István to say something like that. Even though I hadn't met him at that point, István's unusual endorsement was a big reason why I applied, and never regretted it. He was, as always, right. And from and through Russ, I learned that, among other things, nice means having an interest in politics and the common good that is not fueled by the self-regarding, occasionally self-indulgent, insular profession of academic political science and theory. Russ's work is original and powerful, partly because of the person he is, and partly because his concerns are real and because they matter. So, ladies and gentlemen, Russ Muirhead.
Mark, thank you. I almost want to stop now, having heard that sweet introduction, in part so I can savor it, and in part so I don't disappoint anyone after it. Today I'd like to talk about an image of the people, the democratic people, as apolitical. It's common, it's sometimes, I think, irresistible, to think of the people as one, as a kind of natural whole that stands together, uncorrupted, decent, sharing a sense, holding a sense in common, having common sense. And to think that democracy goes well when it empowers the common sense of the people. These days, that image of the peoples, the unified people, contrasts with the picture of our partisan divide on evidence every day in the stories out of Washington, D.C., where Democrats and Republicans stand farther apart than they have at any time since the Civil War. Whereas once the two great parties of American politics covered every inch of ideological ground, partisans today in American politics are either liberals or conservatives. And whether this partisan divide that marks the political class also extends to the people, we like to think of as standing together, is one of the great questions of American politics. One powerful view, a view advanced with verve and analytic acumen and great empirical support, comes from the political scientist Morris Fiorina, who argues that the partisan divide which afflicts political elites or the political class doesn't extend to ordinary citizens. Public opinion, he says, tends to be unimodally distributed. It's still centrist, clustered around the middle. Among everyday people, Fiorina argues the center holds. The problem with American politics comes from political people, political animals, people who run for office, who help others run for office, who volunteer for campaigns, who think about political things, who have convictions about political things, and who act on those convictions, especially those who identify with a party, partisans. They're the ones who betray the centrist center of America, where most citizens reside. The people agree on fundamentals. The political class can't agree about almost anything. And as a result, Fiorina says, the bulk of the American citizenry is somewhat in the position of the unfortunate citizens of some third world countries who try to stay out of the crossfire while Maoist guerrillas and right-wing death squads shoot at each other. What interests me about Fiorina's analysis is not only whether he's empirically right about the character of American public opinion, which I'm not fully able to assess, but what interests me more is an image, a normative image, that fits with his empirical analysis and that gives it urgency. And this is the image of the apolitical people, a people that has no natural interest in the contest over rule. That image is rooted in a strain of modern political thought. One can glimpse it in Machiavelli. I can at any rate see it more clearly in someone like Locke and detect it even in contemporary rational choice accounts of political ambition. So today I'd like to say a little bit about how this image of the apolitical people, which I find very intriguing but also very mistaken, fits with this empirical analysis. I think, as I'll suggest, that the image of the apolitical people points in the wrong direction, especially when we consider alternatives to the contemporary hyperpartisanship that marks the political class. I think it misleads us about the alternative to today's politics. And it might even cause us to mistake something about the nature of our partisanship. But before I get to that, the mistake, let me say more about this intriguing and at least I find alluring, comforting image of the apolitical people unified. One sees it, for instance, in one of the magnetic generalizations, in unforgettable generalizations of Machiavelli, in words that appear almost the same way in The Prince and in the Discourses, which concern the difference between princes and people. Lots of people like to say there are two kinds of people in the world. There are two kinds of people in the world, this type and that type. Machiavelli says there are two kinds of people in the world. There are the few who want to oppress, and the many who simply want not to be oppressed. Now, there's no judgment in Machiavelli as to whether the few might be morally depraved or bad, or whether the many might be decent or sweet. This is just the way things are. This is a fact. It's like a material fact. There are two humors, Machiavelli says, the few who desire to oppress and the many who desire not to be oppressed. And as humors, these are like pre-rational dispositions. They can't be justified, and they can't be changed. What Machiavelli teaches us is that some people just like to command, like my daughter, who bosses me around. And others are not inclined to command, like my son, who's more easygoing. Some people are like that, and some people aren't, and any stable polity has to accommodate this difference, this fundamental difference. Some people want to dominate. They like to use others for their own convenience and advantage. They want to rule. Others, the rest, most, don't want to rule. They don't want to be ruled, but they also don't want to rule. They, in a sense, want to be left alone. They want to be exempt from any relationship involving rule. Those are the people, the apolitical people. They don't have an interest in the contest in rule over rule. Contrast this political sociology with the picture of politics that comes in traditional political philosophy. As with Machiavelli, Aristotle too sees politics as essentially marked by division between the few and the many. The few are defined by their wealth, the many by their poverty and their freedom. But both want political office. The few to protect their wealth, you could say, the many to relieve their poverty. But both want office for something more than just its utility, its material utility. They want office for the honor that it confers, for the recognition. To rule is to be seen, and they want to be seen. They want to be seen as possessing the qualities that equip one to rule and make one worthy of ruling. And that's why virtue is always a part of politics in the traditional conception. The political contest is fueled by competing claims about what counts as admirable, of what makes one deserving of rule. To make a claim is to say you deserve something. And in traditional political science, deservingness is at the heart of politics. People want to rule because they want to be seen as having the qualities that make one deserving. They want to be recognized as such. To participate in the contest for rule is to participate in an argument about the qualities that make one deserving. So politics in the traditional picture isn't just a contest over rule, it's also a contest over justice. And rule is, the two are connected, where rule is about domination, but justice is about, you might say, domination for a good reason. Justified power. Justice, then, ultimately, in the traditional conception, has to do with balancing the rival claims to politics. These claims that groups make, the many and the few, could be true or false. Unlike the humors that you see in Machiavelli, they might be true psychologically, you either have it or you don't, but they can't be justified. They can't be true in that way. But in the traditional picture, claims to rule could be justified, and they could either be true or false or partly true. And Aristotle, for his part, says that the claims that reliably arise in politics and reliably make politics unstable, the contest of the few and the many, each involve partially true claims. So justice involves balancing, ultimately, those partial claims. In modern politics, where there are no claims, only pre-rational dispositions, inexplicable and unjustifiable desires, either to rule or not be ruled, justice in politics becomes something else. In the modern image, politics is more, I think, about identification. Whose side are you on? Are you with the people or the princes? I'm not sure there's any good reason to be with one or the other, since the humors that incline this way or that way are pre-rational. Most, I suppose, by definition, will side with the people. That's the larger group, if Machiavelli's right. And so justice becomes about protecting the apolitical people from princely ambition. Or to do more injustice to Machiavelli, if you let me map him onto the contemporary scene, it becomes protecting the apolitical people from the partisans, the political animals. Well, if the modern republic goes well, classical political ambition, the kind of desire to rule and claim to rule that we see in Aristotle's description of traditional politics, even the desire to rule that Machiavelli mentions, will find no satisfaction. Political office in the modern conception ideally is more about administration than it is about rule. At least with respect to domestic politics, it should be about the coordination of common things, not the command of others. And since political office isn't meant to invest its occupants with the power of rule, so it also doesn't confer recognition about who deserves to rule, because no one's any more deserving than anyone else. Without this kind of recognition, ideally without power, we might ask, what does political office offer? And sometimes it seems to me that the ideal of political office in the modern republic is a bit like the department chair's office in the Department of Political Science at Dartmouth College. The chair can't herself fire people or cut their salaries or kill them or even order them to get her a cup of coffee or command them to fix her flat tire. She's just there to serve the members of the department by undertaking necessary administrative tasks that the rest of us individually can't undertake for ourselves, like timing our courses so that we don't all offer our courses on the same day at the same time. Now, a desperate person assigned to be department chair might find little crumbs of power scattered on the carpet of the chair's office. And I have some colleagues who have been down on their hands and knees looking assiduously for those crumbs, and when they find them, who make the most of them. But it's a pathetic sight because there's not really any power there. This is administration, not rule. Well, we might say the analogy between the chair's office in the Department of Political Science and political office in the modern republic is really inapt. Political office really is something sexier than being department chair. And indeed, it's common, I read in the rational choice account of politics, that those who run for office are motivated by the desire to reap the rewards of office, such as power, prestige, and income. Those words come from Anthony Downs' account of democracy. And looking around today, one might wonder whether office holders could possibly be motivated by those aims. I mean, to the extent that people can name their member of Congress at all, and I suspect most can, they might question the capacity, the decency, the sanity of somebody who's willing to devote himself to working in an institution with a 15% approval rating. It doesn't seem like the pay that public officials get is all that substantial. It's dwarfed by what a mediocre talent can make on Wall Street. If you're after income and you go into politics, again, we might have to just question how rational you actually are. And as for power, well, members of Congress, it seems, can order very few people around. They have sizable staffs, but sort of like the department chair, they can't really ask their staff to do anything all that satisfying. As one scholar of Congress concedes, in truth, very little makes the job of a member of Congress attractive. There are plenty of other jobs that pay more money, are less demanding, and even feed one's ego more generously than that of a U.S. representative or senator. So if one were to try to explain why some want office, the site of political power, it seems just as realistic to say that those who desire to serve in political office do so because they care about the country. And they want to empower the principles and convictions that they believe in. That might seem a more noble motivation, as well as a more realistic motivation, than the desire for power, prestige, and income that Anthony Downs assigns to them. But that more noble motivation, it turns out, only compounds the problem of protecting the apolitical people from political animals. People motivated by conviction about public things, independent of what's in it for them materially, can corrupt the modern republic in a different and deeper way than the traditional exemplars of corruption, such as office seekers who wanted the spoils of office, like patronage jobs. And indeed, Fiorina finds that part of the problem one of the causes motivating the disconnect between the hyper-partisan political class and the apolitical people today is that the political class is dominated by purists. He gets that term, purists, from a great article of in a political science journal. In 1965, Aaron Wildofsky publishes an article in Review of Politics where he coins this term, purists. And in the article, he's trying to explain why Barry Goldwater got the Republican nomination in 1964. Why Barry Goldwater, someone who in Wildofsky's view was destined to lose, got the nomination. Wildofsky says, the death wish is not supposed to be dominant among politicians. What happened? How could he get nominated? Well, what happened was that in 1964, the influence of old-style politicians who just wanted office for its material benefits, spoils, had given way to purists who placed principle above victory. And in this article, Wildofsky quotes from a number of interviews that he did with delegates to the Republican National Convention in 1964. These interviews read like interviews with contemporary Tea Partiers. For instance, here's an example. He asked one delegate about the qualities that the delegate thought a presidential candidate should have. Moral integrity, the delegate responded. Well, should the candidate be able to win the election? Wildofsky asked. No, the delegate responded. Principles are more important. I'd rather be 1 against 200,000 and believe I was right. Another delegate was asked, do you think if the party loses in November that it ought to change its principles? No, the delegate responded. I'm willing to fight for these principles for 10 years if we don't win. For 50 years? The interviewer asked. Even 50 years, the delegate responded. And that's what the Republican Party has done. Another one asked whether it's better to compromise a little and win than to lose and not compromise, responded, I don't believe I should compromise 1 inch from what I believe deep down inside. Wildavsky concludes his article with the speculation that, quote, the Goldwater phenomenon, which once seemed so strange, may nonetheless become a persistent feature of the American political scene, end quote. And who says political science can't predict? Without a single regression, he did it in that article. In Fiorina's account, of course, Wildavsky's speculation proved prescient. What he discerned at the '64 convention now characterizes American politics. Some think it just characterizes the Republican Party. Others see the trend that Wildavsky put his finger on as a trend toward less compromising, more principled, more ideological politics as characterizing American politics more generally. Either way, this brings us back where we started. As Mo Fiorina tells it, American politics is beset by a political class that's terribly out of touch with ordinary Americans, where most Americans are pragmatic and decide issues on a case-by-case basis. The political class is ideological, more prone to align or derive its conclusions from first principles of political morality. When most Americans don't have very strong views or ambivalent or in the muddled middle, the political class is marked by complete certainty in its own rightness. In contrast to the elites of the mid-20th century who sought the material rewards of office, jobs for their friends, the political partisan of today desires, as Fiorina puts it, to impose his view of a better world on the rest of society. The political class today is constituted by political animals who want to rule, want to remake the society according to their image of what's good, their understanding of what's good. And that is what's disconnected the political class, political animals, from the apolitical citizenry. Fiorina writes, contrary to the implicit assumptions of most democratic theorists, who he says get tears in their eyes when they read about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, so beautifully attended, without pausing to think how boring life was in the agrarian societies, pre-industrial agrarian societies. Contrary to the implicit assumptions of most democratic theorists, the typical American does not wish to devote very much of his or her free time to politics. The simple fact we must deal with is that for most, political participation is not a natural act. It's not natural to harbor conceptions of a better society and to devote your life, or even part of your life, a substantial part of your energy, to empowering those conceptions, to actualizing those conceptions through the use of political power. That's not natural for most people. That's natural maybe only for the few. And that's how the political animals of today have turned traditional understandings of corruption on their head in this analysis. What we used to think corrupted politics, giving leaders discretion, say, to bestow patronage jobs or tailor policies to their supporters or contributors' liking, in fact, in Fiorina's telling, actually kind of connected the political class to the citizenry. What we used to think would purify politics, leaders with the moral integrity to act from principle, regardless of electoral cost, in fact corrupts the polity. It gives control of the government to the political animals who, by virtue of acting on convictions about what makes for a good society, are alienated from the apolitical citizenry for whom politics is unnatural. So the political class, and this is my kind of extension of Fiorina's analysis, you won't find it in his writing, the political class corrupts the modern polity, not just by disconnecting representatives from the constituents, but by fundamentally changing, that is to say, destroying the regime. The strategy of modern politics, a teacher of mine once told me, is to lower the goalpost in order to score more goals. Instead of a polity that confers recognition on those who rule and thus sets in motion a contest over who deserves to rule, rendering politics unstable, modern politics lowers the stakes. It concedes from the start that no one deserves to rule, and it places, or it attempts to place politics in service to purposes that everybody shares. Those may not be the most exalted or inspiring purposes, but they're common purposes. The modern polity gives no one a chance to rule, to impose his own conception of a better society on the rest, to use Fiorina's terms, and thus displaces the question of who deserves to rule. It's made for those who prefer longevity to premature death, comfort to pain, not for political animals. By changing the terms of politics, by making politics the place where we can impose our own conception of a better world on the rest of society, political animals raise the stakes of politics. They make it, therefore, harder to live together peaceably and cooperatively. That's the real corruption that they bring. And that's why this image of an apolitical people, I think, gives a kind of moral urgency to the empirical analysis that Fiorina offers. And if you follow me, I'm the one who's sort of drawing out his empirical analysis a couple steps beyond what he does. Well, I don't think the image of an apolitical citizenry is fair. And I don't think it's fair in part to political animals for a variety of reasons. And I'll just try to briefly point to two in closing. What might happen? Consider what might happen if apolitical types, those for whom politics isn't a very gripping hobby or full-time occupation, what would happen if apolitical types were to get more involved in politics? Would they be able to retain their apolitical sensibilities, or would they somehow end up looking a little bit more like the political animals who are said to dominate our political class? To make that question more concrete, I want to invite you to consider the question of abortion, the legal permissibility of abortion. Fiorina shows that even on that issue, even on that seemingly most divisive issue that relies on non-negotiable moral values, even there, most Americans agree. Most Americans agree, he shows, that abortion should be legal when a pregnancy poses a threat to the mother's life. Most agree that it should not be legal when the parents would prefer their fetus to have a different gender. There are other circumstances: financial distress, fetal defect, a threat to the mother's health but not to her life, that elicit a little bit more of a difference, but even there are large middling levels of agreement. As Fiorina says, when given a stark choice between classifying themselves as pro-choice or pro-life, as the political class does, Americans divide fairly evenly with a slight edge to pro-life. But these simple labels make a mockery of the nuanced views that Americans actually hold. So this is an example of the disconnect between the political class and the common sense center. There is still a common sense center, even on this seemingly ultra-divisive issue of abortion. But that common sense center isn't represented because the political class is polarized into more extreme pro-life, pro-choice positions. But the question for legislators is how to translate nuanced views into law. So we know, if we accept Fiorina's analysis, that a majority think that abortion should be legal in cases of incest, and that a majority does not think abortion should be legal in cases of financial distress. And one might imagine a very nuanced piece of legislation that could differentiate between these two circumstances. if the nuanced piece of legislation is drawn in a manner that minimizes the chance that someone in financial distress could access an abortion, then it might also prevent at least some victims of of incest, from also getting access. Conversely, if the legislation were drawn to ensure that no victim of incest were ever denied access, it might be difficult in practice to also exclude those seeking abortions out of financial difficulty. What matters with legislation is which kinds of errors you find more tolerable. Would you rather have legislation that prevents access to some incest victims in order to be absolutely certain that no one who feels her fetus has the wrong gender could get access? Or would you rather be more certain that no incest victim is ever denied access, even if that means that in practice the policy will be broad enough to permit some people who think perhaps their fetuses have the wrong gender to also get access? Which kind of error troubles you more? The answer to that question will push you a little bit away from the center, closer to one of the pro-life or pro-choice extremes. The legal question of abortion, the question of how to legislate on the topic, is not reducible to the moral question of what ought to be permitted. Legislation can't always reflect all the nuanced considerations that inform moral judgment. Legislation is a clumsy thing because it relies on many thousands of people in lots of different roles, applying general rules to hundreds of millions of people in widely different circumstances. If the political elites are more polarized than ordinary citizens, some of the difference might arise from the fact that political elites focus on legislation, while ordinary citizens might think about the nuanced moral truth of the matter. If the apolitical people were to get more political, they might need to think more carefully about legislation and the way it's implemented, and that might push them away from the center. At any rate, this points to a different inflection, a different understanding of the political animal. The political animals think of rule not just as imposing their way, their conceptions on the rest, but as forming the rules that we live by. They're interested in rule in part because they're interested in rules. And that interest might lead them on occasion to a more extreme or more internally consistent view. It might lead them to a more confident view than those who are not interested in politics have. And rules permeate the society. The modern polity, which tries to protect every individual from rule understood as domination, does so by extending its rules into every domain of life. Aristotle, who thought the people were political, could conceive of a kind of apolitical zone, the household. He may have been wrong to think of the household as apolitical. That's the charge that contemporary political theorists would usually bring to him, that he didn't see the politics of the household. He thought it was a non-political site. Today, there's no site that's immune from politics, in part because the modern state, which seeks to protect people from domination, from rule, has to extend its rules into the household to protect children, say, against the violence of their parents, or into the classroom, as the Department of Education is doing today, to redefine the norms of consent as it licenses sexual activity for students, into the workplace, into every sphere of common life. And that extension, so we have a society that's political all the way down, even though it's a society it's a polity that's founded in a way on restricting, on constricting the ends which politics serves. That ends up widening the extent, the domain over which political power acts. It multiplies the occasion for disagreement about rules, about what they ought to consist in and how they're applied. It gives rise to many differences of opinion, which have been and are often collected in a persistent, if somewhat tedious ideological divide between those who want more and those who want less government. The people may be ambivalent and they may be conflicted, but they're not apolitical. And it's impossible to be apolitical in this society. It's not possible in such a politicized society. And I think the political class is trying to sift through the political disagreements and views of people in order to engage the debate over how extensively political power ought to operate. I also think that lurking in the disagreements about the rules that govern everyday life and that habituate us really from the time we're born, that's the extent and power of the modern polity. Lurking in those disagreements aren't just administrative, sort of technocratic differences about what the most efficient or effective rules might be that serve purposes we all agree on. I think lurking in the arguments, the differences that the rules of the modern state give rise to are deeper disagreements about the very ends that government can serve. And even lurking in those differences are exactly the kinds of claims that Aristotle said motivated political contestation, and which modern political thinkers tried to exclude from political contestation. Claims about who is deserving and what kind of life deserves recognition. And so in closing, I'll just say I think, for instance, even in the contest between the rich and the rest that we hear so much about in today's politics, as it's come to be noticed by all, as the increasing concentration of wealth and income and the few come to be noticed by all. In that contest are, I think, claims about what people deserve by virtue of the kinds of persons they are and the kinds of lives they live. Is labor an activity that generates a claim to possess enough to count as a full member of society? Is that the primary claim? Or is it wealth that generates a claim, especially when wealth arises from ingenuity and courage? Or is it mere life that's enough to generate a claim? Should we have a guaranteed minimum income? Questions about who deserves what lurk just beneath the familiar distributional politics of who gets what. Partisans at their best, and I don't think the partisans that populate American politics today are usually examples of partisans at their best, but partisans at their best understand this. They know how to appeal to these claims, how to represent them, and how to broker them. We'll need better partisans than we generally have at the moment if we're to address this question, say, of inequality, which is also a question of what kind of country we want to have and what kind of world we want to bequeath. Real conflicts of ideals inform our answers, our positions to questions like the question of inequality. And to negotiate the rival claims that arise via questions like that will take not true believers for whom everything short of perfect victory is a perfect defeat, and also not neutered administrators who insist that their power has nothing to do with rule. It will take good and better partisans. Thank you.
So Russ has asked me to keep the cue, which I will. I'll start with an instruction. You see I'm touching this black box in front of me. There's a little word on it that says push. You have to hold this down in order for your question to be heard and, more importantly, to be recorded. Let me take the privilege, though, of asking the first question. So I once was in Paris in front of the Pompidou Center and was watching various people stick knives through their necks in order to get money from people as they would, do their show, and they would put a knife through their neck and they would bleed and they would get more money. And I asked one of them, why do they do what they do? Why would they stick a knife through their neck? And he said to me, If I didn't have to stick a knife through my neck to get money from people, I wouldn't. But this is what I have to do to get people to give me money. And so this image, when we think about polarization in politics, I'm going to suggest the following connection here. If you think of politicians and their need to connect to the public, and the needs are different for different purposes, might see polarization as the equivalent of sticking the knife through their neck. And I suggest that because what's interesting about American politics is it's inconsistently polarized, right? On some issues, social issues, there's a nice left-right polarization. We can understand it. But on some issues, what you can think of as money issues or business issues, there's not really much of a polarization in American politics. We don't have a traditional Labor Party about labor anymore. We have a bunch of people trying to compete in the middle. And of course, from the way I perceive what's going on in American politics, that inconsistency nicely tracks the way in which you might maximize the amount of resources you can suck out of the public to fund your campaigns or do other stuff like that. But I wonder whether if you have a conception of what the politician needs from the people, it helps you understand how they try to attract the people through the means that might be producing polarization or suppressing polarization.
Yeah. Well, one theory has been, almost every political reform that has been guided by the image of the apolitical people that intends to somehow disempower the political class and return or give political power to the people. I think it's fair to say every such reform has failed or disappointed its the hopes of its advocates. And one of those were primary elections. Primary elections were instituted in part to wrest control of party nominations from the corrupt party machine and the bosses and turn over control to the people. And today, primary elections are identified by some as one of the prime causes of polarization, because the only people who remember or who are motivated to vote in a primary election are hyper-partisans. So the way that that person had to cut his knife to get money, the only way a politician can get a nomination is to appeal to the 8% that shows up in May sometimes, or June, or some weird day in September to vote in an election that no one knows about. And that might be, so anyway, that's now fueled another reform, the blanket primary in California, the California state legislature being one of the most polarized, the top two primary, so that they're no longer primary elections about party nominations. They're just about picking the two most popular contenders in a kind of runoff. The question, if that's right, the question is how unrepresentative really are those who show up in a primary election? And on my analysis, my hunch, I'll just leave it at that, my hunch is that though it's understandable that many voters wouldn't, for good reasons, be motivated to participate in a primary election, if they were, for some reason, to compel themselves to, they would end up acting a lot like the people who show up. They would have to get informed much more minutely about questions of public policy. And they might think more broadly about how different issues connect with each other. I'm not sure they'd end up just like the people who dominate the Republican primary electorate as it exists right now, but I bet they would be more polarized than the center. So yes, politicians have to appeal to the extreme in our system, right now, to get nominated, and that drives polarization. How pathological that is a further question. How much of a betrayal of what a healthy American democracy would look like, is a further question. And I think a lot of the difference has to do with, I think in a weird kind of way, partisans are almost tainted by the apolitical ideal of politics, which allows some of them to think that there's a right answer to every question of public policy, an entirely right answer, that there's a rational solution, and can cause them to believe that the solution they've come to is that one, and hold it with perfect certainty and not want to compromise at all. And I think actually if they were to see politics as beset by rival claims, which are interesting because they're partially true, but not as true as their advocates might think them, that they might actually be not more centrist, but more compromising. I'll stop there.
Russ, you've given us you've done a great job of smoking out the normative implications of this picture of politics in both Fiorina and the political scientists. And you've also given a powerful critique of it, saying that that's too tough on the partisans, the political animals, and it overly valorizes the apolitical people, and you suggest that they may not be all that apolitical after all. And all of this seems to me very persuasive and compelling. And you're a critic in general of this image of the one people apolitical. The question that occurs to me, listening to this persuasive critique, is why then is the easiest way to flatter the people to call them apolitical? Barack Obama's 2004 keynote address, which catapulted him to power, which had great resonance. We are not the blue states of America or the red states of America. We are the United States of America. It was channeling the picture that you're criticizing.
Right, that you're right to criticize.
Yeah.
It was
channeling that. It was the source of the highest, most resonant political rhetoric, and continues to be in his hands and in the hands of other effective politicians. So why is it, if you're right, that the picture of one people apolitical is flawed? Why is it that the public, never mind the politicians, is so enamored of it?
I would speculate that that this might be this might be true in American politics for a distinct reason, and that is that the unity of the people is ideational. It resides in a kind of agreement, in almost a philosophic agreement. It doesn't reside in an ethnos, or we couldn't deceive ourselves that we all descend from a common ancestor, or that we're born of this earth. So without a kind of terrestrial patriotism or an ethnic patriotism, the unity of the place seems to be given by only an agreement with ideas. I mean, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And so I would speculate that the prospect of disagreement about ideas, and especially even fundamental ideas, is more terrible to the American mind, because it seems to present the specter of disunion. How could the country hold itself together if it no longer agrees? And it's a curious feature of American politics that so many, politicians and policy advocates situate their advocacy in reference to the Constitution, or to the founders, or to the founding principles of the Republic, as if, were you to agree with those, and we know we all agree with those, then you would have to agree with me that the Affordable Care Act is an abomination. It's a violation of our sort of founding compact, which is the only thing that holds us together. And so that's why I think ideological disagreement is so fearsome, and that's also why I think the invocation of agreement might be so effective, rhetorically in American politics. And I don't mind the rhetoric. I mean, the rhetoric, seems, if rhetoric is sort of using false premises to lead to a true or desirable conclusion, then there's nothing wrong with it. The problem, that what I began to fear over the last 6 or 7 years is that Obama actually, especially in his first term, and maybe the beginning of his second term, that he believed his rhetoric. When he was running in 2008, I thought it was just, clever and effective, and I thought if this is how a liberal gets elected, terrific. Tell them there's no red America, blue America, there's only the United States of America. It's true at some level, and at the level that counts, but it's maybe not true at the level of policy, even foreign policy. That sounds fine. He must know that, I thought. He must know that he's going to be engaged in a partisan fight. And then I began to wonder after he was elected if he really had no idea. He didn't think of himself as a partisan, as a carrier of the purposes that have bound together the Democratic Party since the New Deal. Every Democratic presidential aspirant in my lifetime has kind of vied with each other to present the best plan for universal health care. And so, of course, it should be no surprise that if a Democrat got elected with a unified Democratic control of the legislature, that they might actually get something through, as Clinton tried to and as Obama did. But the Democrats I thought they couldn't deceive themselves that when they did that, they would be met with universal acclaim, because there's another party that's been opposing that since Truman. And what makes you a Democrat in a way, or what's made one a Democrat over the past 20 years is back to when I was a boy, and I remember seeing Ted Kennedy campaign on, universal health care, was a belief in that cause, and the memory of the failed efforts to pass it. The older people had a longer memory, and younger people but everyone could remember some failed effort, whether it was 1991 or back further. And Obama couldn't seem to understand himself, as a partisan. He couldn't. You call it rhetoric, and I agree it's rhetoric, and it's curious that it's so effective. But I think Obama thought it was more than rhetoric, that it was true, and that he could carry the common sense of the people into office and empower it, and be praised, collect bipartisan support for it.
It's a really interesting series of thoughts. I had two thoughts which may in fact pull in rather different directions, so I'll try both and you can tell me whether they do or not. The first is on this question of the purist, where you accept the idea that we're ruled by purists at the moment, the old-fashioned politician who's ambitious for power, status, money, etc., has sort of vanished. And the evidence for that is you'd have to be pretty crazy to expect to get those sorts of things out of being an ordinary congressman or even an ordinary senator. But of course that's actually always been true, really, hasn't it? And the obvious psychology of the ambitious politician was that of a gambler. The expectation was, or the hope was, they would really hit the big time in terms of power and status and money. I'm not sure that's vanished. If you look at the Clintons or the Blairs, you say, you could make that sort of money on Wall Street. I'm not sure the Clintons or the Blairs would have made the sort of money they've made, let alone having the status and power and being a jet around the world and all the rest of it through Wall Street. Now, only some people are going to pull that off, and most politicians are going to fail. In fact, Enoch Powell famously once said, all political careers end in failure, which is probably actually quite a profound observation about politics. But politicians don't believe that. They all think they're the ones who are going to pull it off. And you're going through the sort of cursus honorum of the boring, lesser jobs, but eventually, you might hit the big time. So the temperament here may still be one of sort of old-fashioned, trollop-style ambition, going up the greasy pole, the Disraeli phrase, and so on. That sort of 19th century picture, that may still be the psychology of a lot of politicians. I mean, the ones I've met, it often is. So that's the first thought, that it may be that you're overestimating the degree to which purists are on the rampage. But the second thought is, in a way, also sort of raising some questions about the apolitical people. But here I'm very sympathetic to your general view. But I'm not. I think there's an element here which is important, which is people tend to manufacture or clarify their views when they're in a position where doing so matters. And the really interesting case, actually, I think, here is something like a jury. And it may also be that, the fashion for thinking about political office in lottery terms, and there are a lot of people out there who think the whole thing should become a lottery, is sort of connected to this. Because the rather interesting feature of juries is, on the whole, jurors do behave rather responsibly. They do have clear views, often about desert, actually. They're not a sort of apolitical group. On the other hand, they're not thinking like that until they're put in the setting where they have to. And my own view about the sort of apolitical people is they've been depoliticized. They've been rendered apolitical. They don't start apolitical, but there's every reason why they should be apolitical, because the structures are such that by and large they're not called upon to do anything very much politically. And that goes along with, the whole ideology that your vote doesn't matter, et cetera, all that stuff. So there's a sense in which that might be a rather optimistic comment on what you're saying, which is you can actually make people political. They're not naturally apolitical, but they have been depoliticized, and the structures actually help to bring that out. I'd like your thoughts on those two thoughts.
Yeah, I guess the idea might also be that if the people have been depoliticized by virtue of inhabiting a regime that gives them no occasion to develop their political thinking or political capacities or exercise power, that there might be, some might say that's good because that's what holds them together. The more political they become, the more the divide that infects the political class comes to infect the whole society, and the more difficult it becomes to stabilize the polity. So maybe that's part of the modern aspiration to a depoliticized citizenry. And there is this question about, what happens to the desire, if Machiavelli's right, and some have a desire to dominate, what kind of happens to it in a modern republic? And I said that if in the ideal of a modern republic gives no satisfaction to that desire to dominate. And some would say that it's really the kind of Lockean republic that creates an outlet for this, that sort of satisfies it, but also distorts it at the same time. And you know this better than I do, really. In the Lockean state of nature, there are these types who desire to dominate. They're sort of problematic because they don't accept the law of nature that they're equal, and they're equal with respect to the claim to rule. That the claim to rule is kind of scattered about promiscuously, and it's not evident who deserves to rule in nature. So no one deserves to rule, you could say. But there are some, the quarrelsome and the contentious, who would make themselves dominate, and they're to be treated like a rapacious predatory species, like a lion or a tiger, and killed, Locke says. But maybe they're not all killed, and some of them end up in political society, and what they're offered is the prospect of unlimited acquisition. And so God gave the world to the industrious and the rational, not to the quarrelsome and the contentious. The quarrelsome being those who would assert their claim to rule. They're starting a quarrel that can never end. And Locke says it's rational to labor and it's rational to acquire, and it becomes rational in Lockean Republic to acquire without limit. So this is in the depoliticized condition, the desire to rule, the stirring, you might say, or the humor goes in a direction toward acquisition, which is consistent with the depoliticized people and safer for everyone. If Larry Ellison gets to rule Oracle, and who's made worse off by that? No one could say. But then the other response is that this is really maybe a real defect in the modern regime, that there's no occasion for people to exercise their political capacity and develop it. And this would be the case in a Tocquevillian analysis. And what he loved about American democracy, wasn't the federal government, but was the township government, where everybody got a chance to deliberate about common affairs in a very concrete way. And he argued that this was, temporizing and enlightening. And we like to say that still characterizes American democracy, but unless you're in a little New England town, kind of like one I live in, it doesn't. And there's no occasion to participate in rule. And this maybe disempowerment, I might speculate, it makes people more shrill. It's almost like you have to say something extreme and uncompromising, both to satisfy yourself, your own frustration, and to be heard. Anyway, that's a set of...
Like Richard, I wanted to get a grip on the self-understanding of the purist, because I think you're right to recover Wilaski and show how prescient he was, and this indifference to electability, right? This picture, does it matter at all how competitive this candidate is? And at least on your reports, indifference to that. That's one feature of the purist. The odd thing is that, especially early in a campaign, we can also overvalue electability to the point that you might think that we want some guidance on the balance between the two. Sort of the person who places no value on it has done something wrong, but the person who overvalues it's like the 10% or so, maybe it's a little less, of people after an election who say they voted for a candidate but clearly didn't, but they want to be associated with the winning candidate. They want that psychological need. That seems odd, but that's another kind of, give us a picture into the purist, that's the opposite of the purist that we should avoid? And how can we get some sort of a principle that helps us weight electability in the right kind of way?
I find the idea that American politics has been kind of infected by purism. It's very intriguing, and it does seem, just to my lay eyes, reading the paper, to be true of about at least 36 members of the Republican conference in the House right now, who somehow are making it very, very difficult for the Speaker of the House to collect his majority, even behind bills with his party stamp on them. So it doesn't take that many purists in a system replete with veto points to create a lot of problems. So it may not be, and it certainly doesn't look like it's the case, that this is true of all office holders. There might be much room for still traditional ambition, Richard, to fill the halls of Congress, but everyone doesn't need to be a purist for this analysis to be right. The more interesting question, I think, is, and anyway, I do sometimes wonder if the party divide in the United States at the moment is really something more nuanced and more subtle than this picture of dueling liberal and conservative purists really presents. And so I like to think that it is. And sometimes I do think that it is. And to expand on that just a little bit, let me just say a little bit about the kinds of parties and partisanship that I think really would be consistent with a healthy democracy, but also would involve passionate contestation. Traditionally, our parties have accepted a kind of constitutional invitation, an invitation presented by the Constitution to rule. So the American Constitution, on one hand, makes rule very, very difficult by multiplying veto points, by separating powers, and so forth. But it also it doesn't make it impossible. It's possible to rule. You can rule, but in order to do so, you need to collect a majority of a very special sort. Certainly not just a momentary numeric majority that could win an election called for 6 weeks from now. You need to collect a majority that's dispersed in time, that's dispersed in space such that it can elect a majority of 435 equally populated districts, a majority that's dispersed in time so that it can win elections that are staggered really over the course of 4 to 6 years, and can win a majority of states, and can do this all long enough. So it's a durable and extensive majority, the constitutional majority. And partisans, maybe the traditional office-seeking partisans, have done their best to construct a constitutional majority. If that required creating one that was ideologically absurd or completely undefinable, then they did that. They did that. But I think it's the partisanship I'd like to see is a partisanship of vying efforts to construct and compose a constitutional majority, which means vying efforts to represent the whole. And maybe the difference between the sort of traditional partisan contestation that you see in an Aristotelian description of politics and the contestation that the Madisonian Constitution invites is that the different contenders for rule in the Aristotelian and traditional politics were all partial. I mean, they were just part of the whole. They were narrow and incomplete. They couldn't, though they thought they were presenting a complete claim. In Aristotle's view, at any rate, they all fall short. The Constitution tries to overcome that. It calls those kinds of parties factions and tries to create a system that doesn't let them rule. But it does offer a different kind of majority, the prospect of ruling, a majority that can make a good faith effort to represent, to present an image of the whole to the whole. And and our parties, I think, have even now sort of combined the sort of oligarchic and democratic elements in interesting ways so that they each, at their best, present an image of the whole, though it's a rival image and a very different image. And the Republican Party sort of collects, its democratic element is found in its connection to the people's religion, especially Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism, which has historically been the people's religion. And its oligarchic element is its connection and great sympathy for the makers, not the takers. The 1%. It stands with the 1%. And the Democratic Party has a more obvious and maybe more dominant democratic element in standing for the poor, and it used to do that when I was younger, it sometimes still does, and the lower middle class, maybe the middle. And it has kind of an aristocratic element or an oligarchic element in its sympathy for the professors. But seriously, actually, it's got an idea that, there's a certain kind of learning equips you to be a good administrator, and so it's comfortable ceding power to the PhD in taking technocratic advice from the economist or from the lawyer. And it wants to empower that advice. It wants to consult the climate scientists and get to the truth of it. And so it is sort of the scientist, you could say, the PhD that gets a special kind of power in the democratic image. Anyway, that's a back of the envelope thing. But there's each party it's not like it's not a labor party, or they're not just trying to represent a class or a piece of the whole, and then win somehow and get to impose its way, the way of just one piece of the whole on the whole. They're each making an effort to represent the whole. And those are our parties at their best. The more purists do dominate them, the more they decline from that.
I thought this was fascinating stuff, and maybe you started just now to answer the question I've been waiting to ask for a little bit. But I thought there was a tension in the initial talk between things that have been constant, at least throughout the entire modern era, that go deep into the modern conception of the average human being into the modern desire for the rule of law and an end to domination, into the sort of Machiavellian Madison onward in their rejection of Aristotle. There's a tension between those enduring features of modernity being responsible for our current mistaken image of the apolitical people and the political partisans at each other's throats, and very, very recent post-Goldwater phenomena. And I wonder how, if instead of looking at Morris Fiorina's recent work, you were giving this talk in 1950 when APSA put out its call for responsible party government and ideologically representative parties that provide a clear choice, which, sort of the 50 years from Wilson to Goldwater, the general consensus among political scientists that the problem with American politics is that we don't have partisan polarization. And if we did, then we could have responsible party government of exactly the kind a good democratic parliamentarian should want. And so if now, I don't think that's exactly your view, and just now when you were talking about competing claims to represent the whole, it became more clear how that's not your view. But how could it be that the mistaken view you're against can simultaneously be as old as Madison and Machiavelli and the rule of law, and as new as Barry Goldwater, and so new indeed that in 1950, looking empirically at how American politics worked, was precisely the absence of polarization between the parties that was freaking out political scientists in the way that now, with our short memories, we're freaking out about an excess of polarization.
Yeah. Thanks. So I see two different questions there, but just to clarify, I'm not arguing that modern politics causes the ills that beset American politics in the moment. I think that there is an image of the people that's rooted in a strain of modern political thought that is very inviting, it's very powerful, and it stands behind sometimes both our diagnosis of the ills and our imagination about what might improve or reform the polity. And this is the idea that we could somehow not, keep more discerning modern view might be keep the people depoliticized so that they don't get too turbulent. But this idea says, no, turn power over to the apolitical people so that their apolitical decency will renovate the polity. Whether it's the direct election of senators, somehow, over and over again, we want to turn people over to that. And it's an image of the decent apolitical people. And it's a piece of rhetoric that you see, I think, used by the most discerning modern political scientists like Locke, he deploys this. Others, as there's another kind of counter image of the people as naturally quarrelsome. And my wife read this talk. She said, but what about Hobbes? Doesn't he say that the people are always fighting with each other naturally until there's a political power that can threaten reliably to discipline them? Oh yeah, there's that too. That's a different image of the naturally quarrelsome people who would destroy themselves in the absence of a power or a political constitution. And that's, I think, more at home in the constitutionalism of John Adams, or I would say Madison. And I'm much more sympathetic, to that picture of the people than this, what I would think of as a more rhetorical picture of the people together, meant to flatter, I think, so as to solicit support for the project that's being proposed. This isn't a partisan project. This is a project that really appeals to the whole, and we all stand together. I'm not a partisan candidate for the presidency. I'm the candidate that's going to represent everybody, because really we're all together. And this regime, the Lockean republic isn't it's not the rule of the bourgeoisie over the rest. It's really a regime that serves human interests everyone shares. So that's, I think it's a piece of rhetoric that comes from modern political thought. It's not the whole of modern political thought. then that image is used, as I said, to diagnose what's wrong with the polity, and also to direct us to direct our reforms toward a certain kind of cure. And that's where I think it all goes wrong. And Thomas Paine would be more like this. There are these two traditions of constitutionalism. One tradition that says the people need to be constrained and sometimes disciplined so that the laws that come out of a Republican government reflect what's best in people and not just everything they want. And that's like Madisonian, that's the Federalist. And there's another tradition of constitutionalism that says the job of a constitution is not to restrain or constrain or educate or mold or whatever. It's to facilitate. The reason we need a constitution is because the people are many and they're scattered, and their voice can't be heard unless something brings it together. And so the purpose of a democratic legislature isn't to refine and distill, it's just to represent the people's common voice, which is, if not exactly the same, at least harmonious. At least the different notes are harmonious. That 1950 report, the Schatz-Schneider sort of report, the great moment toward a more responsible party government. So, the really curious thing about it is that it doesn't advocate ideological parties. It wants parties that take a distinct stand and that offer people, in its terms, a real choice. That's a quote from the report. But it's that the writers of the report are explicit that the parties shouldn't be expected to be ideological in any way, because ideological politics just don't fit with the genius of the people in America. And so as I imagine, how do you get a real choice that's not at all ideological? I mean, this is, it's like a technocratic choice. There are two ways to deal with structural unemployment. There's the Larry Summers solution, and there's the other economist solution, and the two parties offer a different, sort of technocratic set of policies. And so that's how I think how they imagine more responsible parties, not like the parties we have today. I actually think that, I like that report. I'm not entirely, I just say in closing, I'm not entirely, I'm not as troubled by today's partisanship as many are. I mean, there's a real problem of mapping it onto a separation of powers constitution, and that such that 36 people in the House can kind of immobilize the government. But I think there are a variety of real choices that the parties are clarifying and defining, in part because they're ideologically different. I think part of the ideological difference also comes from a more inclusive polity. The parties could be so similar as they were in 1950 only because of the collective decision by the parties to screen civil rights from the national political agenda and to sign on to a regime of apartheid, racial violence and systematic disenfranchisement. So it was the end of that system that caused this migration of Southern whites into the Republican Party and allowed individuals to sort themselves better into the parties now more liberal and more conservative. And look, we have a lot of people want a system where medical insurers cannot discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. And a lot of people hate the individual mandate. And there are people out there who say, let's only keep the popular parts of the Affordable Care Act. And that is unworkable, hair-raisingly unworkable. And so it actually is a more responsible thing to represent the extremes and say, this is our plan. We passed it. We stand behind it. We want to improve it. We want to defend it. It ensures everybody, or almost. And then the other side that says we should, on day one, I'm going to rip it up root and branch. and those are extremes, but in a way they are more responsible than the middle position that's incoherent and can't be legislated.
So not surprisingly, there's a long queue, and we're almost at the end of time. We have at least 5 people on the queue right now. With that queue, Arthur.
So before your answer to Eric, I would have thought you would just dismiss this as hopelessly utopian, but now I'm not quite sure. So here's another picture of what the people, or what the many are like. I mean, you you present the apolitical one as they neither want to rule nor be ruled. There's another possible view, which is what they want is they want to engage in collective self-rule. And that comes with some aspirations, but also some constraints. They want to do so fairly, and that means both substantively fairly and also procedurally fairly. They don't actually want to take advantage and rule, but they want to work it out together, right? So that doesn't lead to unanimity or agreement, because people could have very radically different views about what that means, but it does mean that they are not simply trying to impose on others, but they have solutions that are different from other solutions. That could still allow for deep political divides. It could lead to contested politics. But the hypothesized motivation of this is not simply trying to dominate, but rather it's that we have a vision of how we should collectively rule ourselves. And I think that comes, if you think of it that way, then restraint comes quite naturally. Now, do people think of this that way? No. If you presented this as a picture to the American people, would they accept it? I would think yes. Now, again, I won't defend against the idea that this is hopelessly utopian, but I will defend that this is not simply apoliticism all over again. No, this is political, but it's having a conception of politics that is moderated by an idea of fairness. Is that hopelessly utopian?
No, I like it. I mean, maybe, so it runs into this, so it only seems utopian because there are no facts to support it, meaning. but we could, so you have to give a sophisticated defense of its realism. And maybe you could say that the people aren't naturally apolitical, as Richard says. They've been depoliticized, maybe by a regime that its founders intended to be depoliticizing. And if they were, repoliticized or reactivated with the right kind of political practice, they would be more like that. And that's exactly, what you describe is the picture of the American citizen that you read in, Democracy in America. And that citizen, overcomes a kind of inclination to privatism, to retreating into their private circle by sort of throwing in the towel. I'm just powerless. This is the people rule, and I'm a tiny part of it. I don't have. Overcomes it through participating in, control of local things, not somehow participating in control of national policies or international policies. But maybe that would be the hopeful rendition. I like that picture. That's consistent, I think, with what I would hope for. Let's put it that way. I think the people are more political than the naturally apolitical image, presents, but that would be the right way to become politicized. And maybe it isn't impossible. Maybe it isn't, it hasn't happened. It's not there, latent, but maybe it could happen with the right kind of political practice. And maybe even, there are deliberative polls, which I find really kind of cool and interesting, but also, sometimes, it seems like Fishkin thinks that, that there will, out of this deliberative poll, come a kind of agreement that people presented informed properly with the time to really discuss things and talk to experts. They all end up, in a kind of around a modal point. And then others who said, no, maybe, with a lot of deliberation, people will actually disagree more intelligently and more deeply. That I think is right too, that they could become political and disagree more, but maybe wouldn't be. So there's the quality of the purist isn't just that they have convictions, it's that they're sure those convictions are right. And the convictions have a kind of rooting in conscience. And so any concession is to kind of admit something evil or risk the entire goodness of the political enterprise. And that's what the right kind of politicization would overcome.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.